Greetings, historians. Welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a short video on why were the Bolsheviks successful in their October coup or revolution, depends who you ask. The big question here is a sort of paraphrasing of a Richard Pipes quote where he says, "The Bolsheviks did not seize power, it fell into their laps." There's another great quote from a historian called Conquest who says that anyone with the guts to try could have taken power in October 1917, so that's what we'll try and understand now. Why were the Bolsheviks successful when they tried to take down the provisional government in October 1917? In terms of a bit of context, in 1913, Nicholas II is weirdly secure on the throne. He celebrates the Romanov Tercentenary, which is 300 years of his family ruling Russia. He'd survived the 1905 revolution by very cleverly, and this obviously wasn't his idea because it was clever, by passing the fundamental law which neutralized the Duma, the Russian parliament, meaning that from 1905 he survives a revolution, Trotsky says with a few broken ribs, but his power is fundamentally unchanged. Get it? Fundamental law. Secondly, the reason he is so secure is because of the guy on the top right of the slide, Prime Minister Peter Stolypin, Vladimir Putin's second favourite Russian apparently, because of his twin carrot and stick repression and reform. The best example of how successfully Stolypin calmed everything down in Russia is that there was 2,500 strikes in 1905 and there was actually less than 20 in 1911. These are Trotsky's numbers in his History of the Russian Revolution, so they're probably quite accurate. Optimists say that if World War I didn't happen, the Romanovs probably would have survived. Maybe even little Alexei would have ended up on the throne. But World War I did happen, Nicholas II did abdicate in February 1917, the provisional government was established, but then it's actually overthrown by the Bolsheviks in October. So the odds of this happening, I would say minimum 1 million to 1. The Bolsheviks were a fringe book club effectively at the start of 1917, very, very small, basically irrelevant. We know they're irrelevant because the provisional government doesn't really go after the leaders. The fact that they managed to take down Russia's brief experiment with a parliamentary democracy is remarkable. How and why were they able to do it? Well, time to explain that. So, first reason and first way of looking at it is you could argue that the Bolsheviks were successful because the provisional government was doomed from the start. This is a very pessimistic view, but it's the argument, and it's quite a convincing one, that the provisional government was overthrown by the Bolsheviks because it was always too weak to survive. There's this idea that the Bolsheviks weren't special. Anyone with the guts to try could have overthrown the provisional government, and this is because of the structural weaknesses facing this new institution. Firstly, dual power with an A, more like dual power with an E, because dual means arguing. Do you get it? Thank you very much. So, dual power system was effectively where the provisional government wasn't the only government in Russia. It was sharing power in this weird sort of wink and a handshake arrangement with something called the Petrograd Soviet. The provisional government was made up of upper class members of the old Duma, but the Petrograd Soviet spoke for the workers and the soldiers. Both were created in the aftermath of the February Revolution, and both were an attempt to restore order to the capital. They agreed to share power, but the Petrograd Soviet is the one with the real power because they have the workers and the army. The provisional government is the one with the legitimacy. They're the official government of Russia, but they don't actually have any real power. This is because of Soviet Order Number 1, the second point on this slide. Soviet Order Number 1 was the very first thing passed by the Soviet where they said, soldiers, workers, peasants, you should go along with what the provisional government says, as long as we agree with it. This meant that from the very start, dual power was a very, very shaky arrangement. The Petrograd Soviet said, yes, we support the provisional government only if we agree with them, meaning that they did agree for the first little bit, but as soon as they disagree, the whole system collapses. Most importantly, World War I is still going on. World War I is probably the main reason why there was a February Revolution. It exacerbated all the existing problems in Russia, and now the new government is in charge of the war effort, and they're in this very, very awkward, difficult position where they can't stay in the war, but they can't leave the war. They can't stay in the war because Russia is getting absolutely drubbed. There's mass desertions. They lost 250,000 men in the first 3 months. They've lost nearly 1 million men by this point. There's 20 train stations that are working. People in Petrograd are eating a third of the bread they ate from before the war. but they also can't leave the war. They can't leave the war because their whole economy is based on war credits from Britain, France, and America. And they can't leave the war because they're losing that badly that if they surrender now, they're going to have to give up loads of their country. They need to leave the war, but they need to start winning the war so they're in a better position to negotiate. This is a huge problem for the provisional government. The Petrograd Soviet, on the other hand, says, let's just leave the war now. That is obviously not a very smart way of looking at it, but the provisional government knows that it can't just leave the war, but it can't stay in the war, and it's kind of analysis paralysis. They just don't know what to do in order to solve this. And then finally, their structural weaknesses is they needed to have the constituent assembly elections. The provisional government, emphasis on the word provisional, was not supposed to be forever. What they wanted to do was have elections to decide on a group of people, about 750, who could write a constitution so that Russia could be a real country, just like Britain and France. But the big issue is they don't want to have this election until after the war's over, which means that they have completely admitted already that they have no authority. So these are the key structural weaknesses of the provisional government, which help to explain why the Bolsheviks overthrew them so easily in October. Gushkov, the guy in the top right of the slide, who was the war minister, actually said, we do not have the authority, but only the appearance of authority. And I think that sums up really, really well the whole idea of the provisional government's structural weaknesses, which is that it was a legitimate government recognised by others, but it couldn't actually do anything. It was so flimsy, and it relied on keeping the soldiers and workers on their side, which meant that they couldn't do any of the difficult decisions they needed to do in order to survive and prosper as a nation. I've just kind of convincingly said that the provisional government was doomed from the start, but this isn't fully true, and there is a counterpoint to all of these. Firstly, there was a honeymoon period for dual power. There was great achievements in the first month. March is actually a brilliant year for the provisional government of Petrograd Soviet. They disband the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. They end Russification. They allow freedom of speech. They allow freedom of worship. All the minorities who've been crushed by the Tsars for the past 300 years are allowed to come out and practice their culture and speak their languages and practice their religions freely. They get rid of the death penalty. They free all the old political prisoners. I'm sure that won't come back to bite them in the butt. What this shows is that before Lenin comes back and before Kerensky comes to charge the provisional government, things were actually going quite well. So maybe the provisional government wasn't always doomed. Things could have been better if some things were slightly different. The provisional government did have a big mountain to climb, but maybe it could have been different. I don't like the idea that anything is inevitable in history. Everything is based on people's decisions. So maybe they weren't doomed from the start. Maybe things could have been different. Maybe I'm too optimistic. Maybe no one's even really listening at this point. It's 5 minutes 30 into the video. My engagement is normally 50 seconds. If you're still here, hello, nice to see you. Secondly, you could argue that the Bolsheviks took over in October because of the provisional government's mistakes. So everything starts to go wrong in April 1917 with the Milyukov crisis. Milyukov was the war minister. He has a meeting with the British and French ambassadors where he says, we agree that we will stay in the war until Germany surrenders. This destroys dual power immediately because the Petrograd Soviet says, nope, we don't agree with that. We want an immediate end to the war. Milyukov has to step down, and he is replaced by Mr. Kerensky. Now, Kerensky is the Anakin Skywalker of this story. He was supposed to restore balance to the Force, not destroy it, and he had the higher ground, Anakin. Sorry, I need to get out of Star Wars metaphor. So Kerensky takes over as war minister and then eventually prime minister after Milyukov is forced to step down because of this crisis. Kerensky is kind of the reason that this whole thing happens. Kerensky makes a couple of bad decisions at he's faced with a few serious challenges, and he gets every single one of them wrong, and he is kind of the main reason why the Bolsheviks take over in October. He actually spends the rest of his life, he flees in 1917, he actually spends the rest of his life as a history teacher, mainly specialising in his time as Prime Minister of the Provisional Government, and he would even admit that he gets some of this stuff wrong here. So firstly, Kerensky takes over as War Minister, and he says that we need to do a new offensive, we need to win a couple of battles, and then we're in a better position to start negotiating with Germany, which is kind of smart. So he goes for the June offensive in June, and it fails disastrously, leading to even more desertions. War morale gets even lower. So Kerensky is in charge. He's like, right, let's try and win a few battles here, and it goes really badly. That's a big mistake, and it makes soldiers even more radical and pushes many towards the Bolsheviks. Then, as a result of this failed June offensive, there's something called the July Days, which is just huge protests in Petrograd. Kerensky responds to this by shooting protesters, which again discredits the provisional government even more, widens the gap between the provisional government and the workers, soldiers, peasants, ordinary people. He then arrests a lot of key revolutionary figures, like Lenin has to flee back to Finland, Trotsky is arrested. But then there is something called the Kornilov affair. Now, Kornilov is bottom right, this dude here. He was the commander-in-chief of the Russian army. He says the provisional government is clearly being threatened, so I'm going to move the army to Petrograd and I'm going to protect you. Kerensky reads that as Kornilov is going to try and overthrow me. He's not here to protect me. It's all a smokescreen. Kerensky panics and Kerensky frees the Bolsheviks from prison. He arms them and he says, right, I need you to defend Petrograd. Kornilov's then arrested. His threat gone away. He asks for the guns back from the Bolsheviks. They say no. So Kerensky's key mistake here is he frees political prisoners, then he arrests them again in July, then he frees them again in August and arms them during the Kornilov affair. This means that when the October Revolution happens, Kerensky puts out a call like, please help me, let's save the government from the Bolsheviks, and everyone ignores him, and it's kind of directly due to his own actions here. Key decisions are fumbled at every single turn, and it guaranteed that someone was going to overthrow the provisional government. The counterpoint here is, it's kind of a stretch here. Kerensky's decisions are not stupid, they are understandable. The problems were maybe too big and too structural for any one man to solve. Now, the other way of looking at why the Bolsheviks were successful in October is because of the Bolsheviks themselves. Was the Bolsheviks' leadership just that amazing that they took over the provisional government? Well, Lenin comes back in April. Lenin is put on a sealed train by the Germans. They say he's like a disease in a test tube and they just want to throw him at Petrograd, shatter it and just destroy everything. And that's kind of what he does, because when he gets back, the Bolsheviks are actually quite happy to work with the provisional government. He calls that accommodationism. He says that the Bolsheviks and no legit revolutionaries should participate in the provisional government. And what this does is it sets the wheels turning for their eventual successful coup in October. They do make some smart decisions in 1917. For example, when the July Days happens, people in the crowds in Petrograd are actually asking for some leadership. Lenin deliberately distances themselves from it. They know that they are nowhere near strong enough to overtake the provisional government yet, so Lenin does something very clever, which is he doesn't snatch at the opportunity. He realizes that they need to be careful, they need to pick their time properly, so that is a good thing. The Kornilov affair is the key thing for the Bolsheviks, though, because once they are armed by Kerensky, Trotsky creates something called the Military Revolutionary Committee, which is basically the group of blokes who just refuse to give the guns back. He then, riding on the popularity, because they're the ones who defended Petrograd from Kornilov, he becomes chairman of the Petrograd Soviet and immediately starts planning an armed coup. And the coup itself was planned basically by Trotsky, and it is strategically quite brilliant. What he did was they seized bridges, post office, telegraph offices, so that there was no way the provisional government could get reinforcements. They fire a warning shot at the Winter Palace, and then they walk in and arrest the provisional government, and there's basically no fighting. Now, is there basically no fighting because the Bolsheviks were that scary? No, it's because Kerensky has alienated literally everyone, and no one wants to help him at this point. The counterpoint to this is that the Bolsheviks weren't actually that amazing. They are basically irrelevant up until the Kornilov affair. We know that because there's the famous picture of Lenin's train coming back into Petrograd, and there's a huge crowd there to see him. The only reason they're there is because the Bolsheviks have promised free drinks to anyone that goes and sees Lenin. Then, in the July Days, they're clearly too weak to try anything. The only reason the Bolsheviks are able to pull this off is because Kerensky fumbles the Kornilov affair and arms them. It's not really because of their brilliance.